Welcome to the Peter King Podcast, coming to you for the first time from the Aloha State on a little family vacation this week, and am really trying to divorce myself after this podcast from all NFL thoughts for a few days. I will be back. The column will be back on Monday. I'll be back home this weekend, but we're on a little bit of a fam vacation. But from Hawaii, I'm going to be joined by Myles Simmons, my partner at NBC Sports, and we're going to dissect for the first time the first 10 picks of the NFL draft. We're going to do that first. Then we're going to get into a conversation I had. This is audio only. It will not be on the video portion of the podcast, but audio only, a conversation I had at the league meetings with Brian Daboll, the NFL Coach of the Year by the Associated Press, the coach, obviously, of the New York Giants. Then on the back end of the podcast, we're going to talk about a few news notes of the week. Number one, Mike Florio's story on Tuesday of this week that the Patriots have been shopping Mac Jones, the quarterback, leads to many interesting discussions. We will also talk about the Jim Trotter story. You know, it's interesting. Jim Trotter, a former Sports Illustrated peer of mine, worked for NFL Network and got released, basically. And so I talked to Trotter and wrote about him in my column this week. The unfortunate thing is, you know, I probably should have put it higher in my column because far and away that was the most responded to piece of my column this past week. So we'll talk about Trotter and what his story portends. We'll also give you a little bit more of the meaning of the Thursday night flex argument that is now going on between the league and 8 of its owners. And also where the Lamar Jackson story goes next, because now it's obvious that there is not a team that is stepping up to go do a contract with Lamar Jackson. So let's get going on this part of the podcast. In my column this week, I wrote about how here's what I hear about the top 4 picks in the draft. And I've heard other things high in the draft. So I thought we would just go 1 through 10 here in the first part of the podcast, Myles Simmons and I. And then we will essentially try to project and give you our best information that we know now about what every team is thinking. And I have to tell you, from having been at the league meetings last week, and I'm sure Myles will feel some of what I'm about to say, it's getting harder and harder to find out real information. You put out stuff, you hope that it's as accurate as possible, and you just put conditions on almost everything because a lot of times you don't know if you're getting the real or if you're getting the phony. Anyway, Myles Simmons, how are you? By the way, Myles, this might be the only time in the history of our podcast where I am actually west of you, because usually I'm doing this from Brooklyn, you're in LA. And so we're a little bit different this week, but how's it going?
Yes. Yeah, you definitely are. Aloha, Peter. Isn't that what they say out there? I hope that things are going well in Hawaii, and you absolutely should unplug from whatever this stuff is for the next few days after we're done with this podcast. But you know, it's funny. I mean, we're getting into the silly season, quote unquote, of draft talk, right? And I think you're right, where it's like you don't necessarily know what's real, what's not. And in some ways, you have to kind of put your filter on of, okay, why am I learning this information from this person? What does this really mean in the larger context of what is the NFL news and what is the NFL news cycle? Like, why am I learning this right now? And so that's how you can kind of figure out, well, is it real? Is it not? I don't know. Is it this? Is it that? Which is why I just like to, when we get to the first round of the draft, because then we actually have real things to talk about.
Yes.
But by that same token, I've evolved my stance on mock drafts in the last couple of years, because I always used to really hate them. And like, nobody really knows what they're talking about. And how are we going to say that this is right or this is wrong? And it's, if you really look at it as we're going through different scenarios with what could happen, then that's how I like to think of these mocks now. And that's kind of why I like what we're going to do. Cause it's not necessarily like we're trying to mock out the first 10 picks, but it's, okay, here's what could happen. Here's what might make sense. And then based off of that, what would happen next? Right. And I think if we approach it that way, it's less of the silly season and more of, let's just talk through some scenarios here. So
Exactly.
that's where my head's at.
Yeah, and I think that's really smart because look, I was very careful in talking about the first 4 picks in the draft on Monday.
Yeah.
I was very careful in saying, in putting conditions on everything,
Yeah.
because, you know, and why don't we just start with the Carolina Panthers at number 1?
Yeah.
And one of the points I made in my column is that there are definitely people inside that organization who love Bryce Young.
Mhm.
I mean, love Bryce Young. And so as I look at this right now, I think that before, when I talked about head coach Frank Reich and his love of large, tall quarterbacks, I have basically talked myself into CJ Stroud for the first pick. But I was told by a couple of people, not so fast, you know, and I think that is where I sit right now. Josh McCown, the quarterback coach of the Carolina Panthers, before he took this job, he had told someone else in the league that he absolutely loves Bryce Young, and you don't see size when you see Bryce Young. So that's one thing that kind of started to make me think a little bit. I hear there are others inside the Panthers who are high on him. So look, it's almost certainly going to be one of those 2 guys, Bryce Young of Alabama, CJ Stroud of Ohio State. And I think at least for the next couple of weeks, it's going to be hard to divine which one it is.
Well, I would think that they have a decent idea from the top brass, you know, with Frank Reich, and Fitterer, the GM, and also Tepper, the owner. They have a good idea of what it is that they want to do, but they are allowing themselves the time to really be convinced of it. And I say that because of what I experienced when I was working for the Los Angeles Rams in 2016. You know, you don't trade up to number 1 for a quarterback, right, without knowing who you really like at that spot. And while you can be moved off of that position after you get more information, it's almost that you are trying to really confirm and go make sure you're ticking every box, right? Dotting every I, crossing every T to make sure that you know exactly what you want to do there. So whether it's Bryce Young, whether it's CJ Stroud, there are reasons to love both of those guys. I mean, there's a reason why one of them is going to be the number 1 overall pick, and then the second one is going to be number 2 overall, right? You look at what they've done in college, their body of work, it is very strong, both of them. And so because of that, you really can talk yourself into one or the other. But I think that because Carolina made that aggressive move, they have a good idea of what they're going to do, because I just don't think that you make that move without having a good idea of what you're going to do.
So let's go to number 2, because we can sort of go around for a long time about the Panthers. The fact is, I don't know who they're picking. They're going to pick one of those 2 quarterbacks. So let's move on. So I heard 2 very interesting things last week. One is that Nick Caserio, the head coach, the general manager of the Houston Texans, picking 2nd in this draft, does not feel like he is forced into taking a quarterback number 2. And the reason is he's got 2 number 1 picks next year, and he's got the 13th pick this year, as well as this 2nd pick. So as this person...
12th pick
this person.
Sorry.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, let's just clarify that.
Yeah.
He's got the 2nd pick and the 13th pick this year. Next year, he has his own pick and another number 1 from the Cleveland Browns.
Yep.
So with all of that draft capital, I was told that Nick Caserio does not feel forced if there's a quarterback at number 2 who he doesn't love, he doesn't feel forced to have to pick a quarterback, and he could then take the safest player by far in this draft, Will Anderson, the edge rusher from Alabama. As somebody said to me last year, you know how it's sort of late in the process, everybody was finding holes in Aiden Hutchinson. And, well, you know, he's not the perfect edge guy. He's not this, he's not that. Well, all Aiden Hutchinson did is basically was, you know, finish second in defensive rookie of the year to, you know, obviously to Sauce Gardner, and have a great year, not a good year, a great year, yeah, including all the sacks and 3 interceptions. So I think that that's the comparison I'm hearing now. He's going to have, Will Anderson might not be Bruce Smith, but he's going to have excellent impact for an edge guy. So, and obviously Houston's huge defensive need is an edge rusher. So everybody, when I wrote this in my column, I got this, oh, you're out of your mind. You're doing the Texans bidding. You're doing this. But so another person with knowledge of people inside the Texans also told me the other day that they would really like to have Bryce Young as their pick. They're hoping that it's CJ Stroud at number 1 and Bryce Young at number 2, because right now they are a little hesitant with CJ Stroud because he's represented by David Mulugeta, who was the agent for Deshaun Watson. And that to me is a little bit of a straw man argument. I don't necessarily buy it, but it's an interesting argument to say that if Bryce Young goes 1 and CJ Stroud is sitting there, could they have some second and third thoughts because they had such a bad experience with David Mulugeta? Now, to me, it's absolutely different because a veteran contract, you know, with Deshaun Watson is a lot different from a slotted rookie contract. So I don't really buy that they wouldn't take him because they have a bad taste in their mouth for the agent of CJ Stroud. How does that hit you?
If that's the way you're constructing your team, you know, because you don't necessarily want to deal with an agent, I think that that's a bad way of team construction. So, I mean, you know, and I think you're right. I mean, look, it's a slotted contract for the number 2 overall pick. And if you have to pay your quarterback in 3 years, then I think that that's a good problem to have in, you know, one of those things that NFL people love to say. So I don't think that that would necessarily be good business. And I don't necessarily know if I buy that either. I do buy that they would rather maybe have Bryce Young than CJ Stroud, you know, because of just a lot of different factors. And the fact that he played for Alabama and all that, maybe. But I think that it would behoove the Texans, I think, to pick either one of CJ Stroud or Bryce Young based on who falls. Because if you can get Will Anderson, fantastic. And it's not that, you know, you don't want somebody who's going to have a really, really good career, right? Or set themselves up to be a great edge rusher for you for years and years and years to come. But if you don't have the franchise quarterback that can make you a competitor year in and year out in the AFC South, then what does that really matter? So I that's where my mind would go there with the number 2 pick.
So I think one of the interesting things is happening with this, with all of this, quite honestly, is that you have a mystery at number 1 and you have a bit of a mystery at number 2. The easiest thing to do is to say that Houston's going to take whoever Carolina doesn't take.
Yes.
And Myles, I 80% believe that. So that's where I stand right now, that quarterbacks will go 1, 2, CJ Stroud and Bryce Young in some order. And then we get to number 3 with the Arizona Cardinals. Mm-hmm. So as I was told at the league meetings, this was by somebody who's a longtime drafter and a longtime GM. He said, listen, the Arizona Cardinals, they got a rookie GM in Monty Ossenfort. And this person, when we were talking about it, said that they probably have the worst overall talent on the roster of any team in football. So when you look at the Arizona Cardinals, you basically say, if there are quarterbacks going 1 and 2, well, they can do one of two things. They can take a ransom for Will Anderson, the Alabama edge rusher, or they could take Will Anderson if there isn't a real ransom out there. But I'll tell you what, I would not do anything. I wouldn't do anything until pick number 3 of this draft. And I'll tell you why. Yeah. Because if my 20% thought is correct, and if the Houston Texans do not take a quarterback at number 2, then either Bryce Young or CJ Stroud is going to be there at number 3. And it's going to be, I think, open season for that pick. So Monty Ossenfort has to be calm, cool, not take any offer, in my opinion, until the draft happens and until he's sitting there with the first pick in his general manager career with 10 minutes on the clock and the calls flowing in. But let me just make one other point, Miles. This general manager who talked to me about this said, listen, you do your groundwork. You don't just start this at the 10-minute mark with your pick. Every team that you think might want a quarterback, every team that you think might want a quarterback, you got to call them, and you have to basically tell them, hey, look, if one of them is here, what are you willing to give? And so you have a little score sheet right then. You say, okay, Tampa's willing to give this, Washington this, Tennessee this, Vegas this. And then you figure out how far down you would go and what you could get in return. And if I'm Monty Ossenfort, I am not taking anything less than that team's first this year and a first next year, even if it's just trading down with the Raiders at 7.
Or, I mean, it could also be the Colts too, right? And if that happens, then what happens if somebody's like, okay, well, CJ Stroud, Bryce Young are now gone, but man, do I want Anthony Richardson? And if I don't get this right now, then I'm not going to be able to do it. I mean, I think that there's all kinds of things that can then happen. The Cardinals are in a decent spot in terms of needing to acquire talent, but you already have the quarterback who you believe can be the franchise guy for your future. And when you don't have to go up for that guy, or you don't have to figure out who that guy is, it makes things a lot easier. The other thing that is or probably a reality for the Cardinals this season, because you don't know when Kyler Murray is going to be healthy, if he's going to be healthy to play at all in 2023, you're probably not going to have that great of a season. And, I don't think anybody wants to say that or hear that in Arizona right now, but look, that's what they're staring at right now. Look, it's going to be a lost year. That's just what it is. You're not going to be very good. So you're probably going to be picking up pretty high in the draft next year too. So if you think of it that way and you say, all right, we can get something for this number 3 overall pick, maybe we end up with 2 really good first round picks next year, and we still don't have to pick a quarterback. That's not a bad place to be to set yourself up for 2024, 2025, right? So it's not fun necessarily to think about it that way when you're talking about the 2023 Cardinals, who are still going to go out and try to win football games. But I think that's the reality of where the Cardinals are right now.
If I'm Monty Ossenfort, and, I really appreciate you saving me on that one, Miles, and talking me through the Indianapolis logic at number 4. We're going to get to the Colts in a second. But if I'm Monty Ossenfort and the Colts say, well, we're just moving one spot, we'll give you our 2 this year, 35th pick overall. And if I'm Monty Ossenfort, I'm saying, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I said, I can go down to 7. Yes. Will I miss Will Anderson? Probably. But I could go down to number 7 for a 1 next year and a 3 this year.
Yep.
Well, or whatever, pick a thing. I want your one next year. That is how this trade is going to get done. And then that's going to be a hard one for Chris Ballard and for Jim Irsay and Shane Steichen. Do we want to give up our one next year? And I think if you get the quarterback you want, you have to use that as sort of a sunk cost. As you know, you don't want to do that, but you're willing to do it to get the quarterback that you want. So let's just say right now that you're Monty Austin-Ford, you're the Arizona Cardinals. You're waiting until draft day. You're doing your diligence beforehand and talking about the value of this pick. And you have your heart set on a one, or let's just say for the sake of argument that the Colts say, we'll give you 2 twos to move up this one spot. I might be okay with that, because that means that in essence, you're going to have 3 picks in the first 2 rounds of the next 2 drafts. And that's also a good place to be. But anyway, there we are with Arizona. So with Indianapolis, as I wrote on Monday, the Colts will work out all 4 of the top quarterbacks this week, finishing this weekend with Anthony Richardson in Gainesville, Florida. And my understanding of this is the reason that the Colts did not have a great presence at all these pro days is because the only thing that they value, and I applaud Chris Ballard for this, because pro days you can watch on TV, and unless you're going to dinner or going to do this with them or that with them, I think Chris Ballard did the right thing in this case by just basically telling all 4 top guys, listen, I want to have some quality time with you a couple of weeks after your pro day. So let's set up a workout. We'll have a dinner. We'll put you on the board. We'll do all of that stuff without being hurried, because you have an appointment with another team right after us. So good for the Colts. And as someone told me last week after I heard about this, look, it's almost useless to project what the Colts will do until they meet with all these quarterbacks. And when they do meet with all these quarterbacks, probably starting this weekend, I think we'll have a better idea, because either the Colts are going to try aggressively to move up if they think one of their guys is going to be their Stroud or Young, or they may want to move to number 3 to make sure they get Anthony Richardson and don't get leapfrogged for Anthony Richardson. So, and as of right now, I don't know, Miles, I can't see Will Levis. I just can't see Will Levis breaking into the top 3. I might be wrong. We'll see if I'm wrong. But to me, this is Stroud Young or Young Stroud, and then Richardson with Levis taking a bit of a tumble.
I would agree with that, based on some of the things that I heard last week and sort of some of the things that I've observed from Will Levis. And it's not, I'm trying to knock Will Levis's character, but I think it's just the performance and some of the traits and the skill set that he's shown is not necessarily something that you would want to take at the top because of the consistency or lack thereof, I guess I should say, at that position. So I think you're right about Richardson. And now Richardson is a lot of projection as well, but especially if you have somebody like a Gardner Minshew who can start for you, can be at least a quality quarterback. He's familiar with Shane Steichen, so he knows the kind of offense that he's going to call. Steichen's called plays for him before as well. So it's not like that's going to be some kind of horrible thing there where you're going to have an incompetent quarterback. I don't think that that's the situation that they're in. So that the Colts, they can take a quarterback if they want, or maybe they don't take a quarterback because the price is too high to get him, or the quarterback that falls is not necessarily the quarterback that they want. So they've at least given themselves that kind of insurance by having Gardner Minshew already on the roster.
Yeah, I think they're not going to be dissuaded from taking a quarterback because of anybody they have in-house. The Colts obviously have had 5 different starters in the last 5 years. They want to find a solution here, and they did not acquire Gardner Minshew to be that solution. They're looking for a long-term solution, and I think whether it be him, Zach Kiefer, the Athletic, wrote it and I think it makes a lot of sense that Hendon Hooker could enter their thought process either late in round 1 by trading back into the round from high in the second round, or by waiting until round 2. Hendon Hooker's an interesting prospect. He
Yeah.
might have been, he certainly would have been right there with Will Levis right now as a mid first round prospect, but he obviously tore his ACL. He claims he'll be ready by this summer to play fully, but that's a pipe dream. You don't play the position of quarterback, and an elusive quarterback nonetheless, never mind, and think that you can be ready 7 months after a ACL surgery. But anyway, let's move on to the Seattle Seahawks. I think the Seahawks, I talked to Pete Carroll at the scouting combine or at the league meetings. And one of the things he said was, he goes, look, because somebody asked him, I was in his little scrum, somebody said, how will Geno Smith respond to taking a quarterback if you take him number 5? And he said, Geno will be great. He'll help him every day. And I think he's right about that. Geno Smith has been in this situation almost his entire career. And just because now somebody says, for the first time in a decade, you're the man, you're our guy, that doesn't mean he's not going to help a guy who comes in. So obviously the Seahawks have gone to all 4 pro days. They're right there in an interesting spot in the draft. You almost certainly think that there will be 3 quarterbacks picked before the 5th pick in the draft. So would Seattle trade up to Arizona? Would Arizona want to trade with Seattle and give them a quarterback of the future? Or would Monty Ossenfort of the Cardinals take a little bit less from somebody else, even because he doesn't want to give Seattle its quarterback of the future who could beat you for the next 10 years? So it's going to be an interesting spot. But the Seattle spot at number 5, this is where I first will consider and first will think about Jalen Carter.
Mm-hmm.
Jalen Carter, as everybody knows, he's a defensive tackle from Georgia. He's had a lot of problems. He was involved and found culpable to a lesser crime in the alleged drag racing situation that resulted in the deaths of 2 members, 1 player and 1 member of the staff at the University of Georgia. He basically stayed at the scene and all that. And so there's that, and there's the fact that there are a lot of questions. Todd McShay of ESPN started asking these questions late in the season about his character and about his willingness to practice and things like that. So there are a lot of questions right now about Jalen Carter. Drew Rosenhaus, his agent, has told Adam Schefter, hey, listen, Jalen Carter is only going to visit or spend significant time with the teams in the top 10 of the draft. We're not going way down. He's not going out of the top 10. So we'll see if he's right. But this is the first place where Pete Carroll's never afraid of taking on people who others think have character issues.
No doubt. And I would point to Frank Clark as one really good example of that, who they drafted several years ago, but it's still John Schneider. It's still Pete Carroll. So I would agree with you, Peter. I think that's kind of the first place where you're saying to yourself, all right, well, if Jalen Carter's on the board, he would make a lot of sense for the Seattle Seahawks in that situation. And he would definitely improve that defense right away and be a staunch guy in the middle of that defense, provided he performs. So that would make sense to me, as well as looking at a quarterback. But I think that they're going to have to weigh whether or not the cost of drafting that quarterback, and then you don't get that really key defensive player, is worth it, because you do have a guy in Geno Smith who performed so well last year. But that doesn't necessarily take them out of that conversation. So that's why number 5 pick, it's sort of like at number 3, where a lot of things will hinge on that. Number 5 will hinge, a lot of things will hinge as well on the number 5 overall pick, because of the different ways that Seattle can go.
So to me, Seattle is maybe a quarterback, maybe Jalen Carter. And I think they're in decent shape at corner, but it wouldn't shock me because teams are playing 3 corners 70% or more of the downs this year.
Mm-hmm.
And they could also go corner here. And obviously there are good corners in this draft. I want to go to Detroit at number 6 and just give you a feeling from listening to Dan Campbell at the league meetings. I just got the feeling that the Lions, even though Jalen Carter would fit them scheme-wise, I just got the feeling that the Lions are not going Jalen Carter. The same way I got the feeling that the Raiders at number 7 are not going Jalen Carter. And so at this point, I want to clarify one thing. Let's talk just for a second about what exactly Jalen Carter was, pled to in this case. He basically entered a no contest, so there was no trial, but he entered a no contest and accepted a sentence of 12 months of probation. He paid a $1,000 fine, and he's got to perform 80 hours of community service for what the police in Athens, Georgia, had charged him with in connection with the double fatality crash that obviously killed 2 members of the Georgia program. So essentially, this case is done. Jalen Carter just has to do what he's supposed to do now in connection with this. He'll have to see a probation officer wherever he ends up living. And so there's all that. But I just got the feeling in Detroit that, that they don't want to get involved in something that might not be totally clean. And the way I look at the Lions, which I think the Lions are in a fantastic spot in this draft. And I say they're in this fantastic spot for a simple reason. If you look at the Detroit Lions and sort of look at what happened to them, here they are right now. They are picking 6th and 18th in the first round. They have 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. And to me, with 5 picks on the first 2 days of this draft, probably not picking a quarterback because they, at least for now, believe in Jared Goff, who is at a reasonable rate of pay this year. I don't know about you, Miles, but man, the arrow is really pointing up for the Detroit Lions.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that they have a guy who really, really knows what he's doing in GM Brad Holmes in terms of picking those or making those selections right in the draft. I mean, I've spent time in draft rooms with Brad Holmes, in Los Angeles here. So I understand what kind of mind he has and what kind of things that they're going to be doing there. So I think that they are in a really, really good spot where you could say, all right, we don't necessarily anticipate picking this high again in the top 10 if there's a quarterback that we really believe in, say if an Anthony Richardson falls to number 6 overall, and we have Jared Goff at that reasonable rate of pay, so we don't have to play a Richardson right away. You could maybe put him on the Patrick Mahomes method or the Jordan Love method and sit him for a year, a couple of years, if Jared Goff can still kind of get you to where it is that you think you want to go. And then if it so happens that Richardson shows enough progress in practice, then maybe you move on to him. Right. So that's a unique opportunity that they've got, but they don't have to do that. Right. They can still build upon their defense, which started ascending a little more and more toward the end of the season. It definitely did, but there are still pieces that they can add to it. So whether it's a corner, whether it is a defensive tackle or an edge rusher, they've got a lot of options. And depending on the way things fall in the top 5, Detroit should be in a really good spot to land a high quality player. And then they also pick again in the teens. And I think what Brad Holmes did last year in selecting Williams, a wide receiver who, he's probably not going to play most of the season, but you get his feet wet toward the end of the year. And now heading into year 2, he should be an explosive, big part of that offense. It's good team construction, I think. So I like what Detroit has on the board for him right now.
So to me, I think I was kind of surprised. And again, look, I know that a lot of people have Devin Witherspoon of Illinois as the top corner in the draft. And I have no idea right now today whether he's going to be Detroit's pick. The thing that surprises me a little bit, just a little bit, is, he weighs 181 pounds. And in the Detroit, Daniel Jeremiah gave him to the Lions in his latest mock draft.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I'm just a little bit skeptical of that is that they want their corners to be able to be physical tacklers. And I don't know if I'm taking a 180-pound corner, with the sixth pick in the draft.
Yeah.
But again, look, we'll see. Everything is so early. But anyway, let's go to the Raiders at number 7. We talked about how they're, I think that they really, my opinion is they really would like to move up to get in position to take a quarterback. I think that Josh McDaniels is almost his instinct is to be very, very conservative on grading these quarterbacks. And so I won't be surprised. I don't think they're going to overtrade. Okay. I don't think they're going to overtrade to move up to get a quarterback. And I think it's probably more likely that they're going to sit, where they are and do one of two things: take the best available offensive lineman, or take the best available defensive front player to sort of be an addition and really help out Max Crosby on that front. But again, I do think that they're actively investigating trades higher in the draft, and they definitely had interest in moving up to number 1. They just didn't give nearly as good an offer as Carolina did to go from 9 to 1.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. I think, listening to Josh McDaniels, Dave Ziegler at both the combine and then at the league meeting last week, it just seems like they would like to get a quarterback in place that they can all grow together with, and have a guy that can be the guy there for years and years to come. And I understand that. But what they've done is, in signing Jimmy Garoppolo, now they've just brought in Brian Hoyer too. They've got guys who understand what the Josh McDaniels system is and can be viable quarterbacks for you. So you're not pinned into picking a guy just because you have that pick and somebody might be there if you don't necessarily want that quarterback. So I think they've set themselves up all right in that endeavor, but it would not shock me if the Raiders moved up in order to get a quarterback. They're probably going to have to in order to get a guy they really, really like. But I think that conservative nature that Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler have been around kind of their entire football careers with New England. And yeah, I know McDaniels has spent a little bit of time other places, but that kind of conservative mindset, I think, is still going to kind of permeate their strategy and what it is that they'll do when it comes to trying to find that guy, because you can't just entirely, mortgage your future in order to get a quarterback you don't necessarily believe can be that guy for years and years to come, if that makes sense.
Then we get to Atlanta at number 8. We'll just take the last 3 fairly quickly. We get to Atlanta at number 8. And what I think is interesting about Atlanta's pick, I think the absolutely perfect player for Atlanta right here, it would give them basically the best young cornerback tandem in their division by far, I think, is to take Christian Gonzalez. Now, for those who don't know, Christian Gonzalez played at Oregon, 6'1", about 200, 205 probably when he gets in his NFL strength program. So let's say 6'1", 200, but he's a 4.38 guy, did very, very well in all of the drills that show speed and quickness at the combine. So I think Atlanta would run this pick to the board, or to the stage in Kansas City when this pick is up. This would be a great pick for the Atlanta Falcons.
Yeah, and look, they're going in with Desmond Ridder as their quarterback. We understand that, and I understand the reasoning for it. So they've got they have to build their defense that much more. And if you're able to get somebody like that, I would agree. I think they'd be very happy with it.
So let's go to number 9, the Chicago Bears. I think most people believe particularly if every tackle is left on the board, that they just sit here and take either Peter Skoronski, the versatile guard tackle from Northwestern, or they take the Paris Johnson, the left tackle from Ohio State. I kind of think they would favor Paris Johnson in this particular case because, look, the Chicago Bears are a very, very traditional drafting team right now, with Ryan Poles, who, having studied under Scott Pioli in Kansas City, and then Andy Reid, Brett Veach, and then obviously Matt Eberflus, the head coach. They're tradition guys. How they feel about short arm tackles, probably not great. I think that's a little bit too much in terms of talking about a guy who's got short arms. But I just think it's probably likely here at number 9 that they take a need position that they weren't able to address in free agency.
And I think that makes perfectly good sense. Like, you have to be able to build around Justin Fields as much as possible. They went out, they got him a top target at receiver in DJ Moore. So, whether it's keeping an OL from the Chicagoland area in Chicago or picking another guy from the Big Ten, I think that would make a lot of sense.
Number 10, I think this is a fascinating pick because Howie Roseman has shown himself in recent years to be a very iconoclastic general manager. He is not afraid to do anything, even if it doesn't seem really smart in today's football. And I'm not sure this doesn't seem smart, but man, Bijan Robinson would be an incredible pick for the Philadelphia Eagles at number 10. And look, who knows? Can you imagine if you're Howie Roseman and you have Bijan Robinson or Jalen Carter to choose from right here? And look, I don't think, having picked Jordan Davis high last year, who essentially is a Jalen Carter play-alike guy, I don't think that it really matches their need. But I'm telling you, Howie Roseman, if they love Jalen Carter and think Jalen Carter can be managed, that won't shock me here. But and look, he can go in a lot of different directions here. But to me, I think Bijan Robinson in the hands of Nick Sirianni it would be a tremendous weapon. Players have, Todd McShay and several have said that he might even turn out to be a better pro than Saquon Barkley. And I think his versatility, especially to a team that loves to throw to its back in Philadelphia, I think would be great.
It's interesting because you don't often see a team go to the Super Bowl and have a top 10 pick. And so that's where the Eagles are. And it's not like they had a roster full of holes. Now, they've lost some guys in free agency. So, I mean, I could certainly see them trying to restock and reload at D-line, especially given the way that they've rotated guys in and out. And we saw how effective that was. Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, those guys aren't going to play forever. So it would make sense if they would address that, or then they can address offense, which is a position of strength, where you're talking about their running game, and get even better at that. I could see the Eagles going in a lot of different ways.
Back on the podcast, and we're going to go quick hits in our last 4 topics of this podcast. We're going to start first with what Mike Florio reported at Pro Football Talk on Tuesday. And that is that Mac Jones was shopped by Bill Belichick to several teams. And I think including the Raiders with Josh McDaniels. But I think what's interesting about this is that you haven't really heard a discouraging word from Belichick about Mac Jones, but you also haven't heard a full-throated endorsement of Mac Jones by Bill Belichick. So I think this is going to be an interesting one to follow, because clearly if the Patriots want to quash this story, they can quash it. If they want to give it life, or they want to, they may just no comment it. And we'll see what happens. And by the time you've heard this, there could well have been a reaction from the Patriots. But my first reaction was, if they somehow, somewhere can find a landing spot for Mac Jones, how interesting would it be to have the Patriots then go try to make a deal with Lamar Jackson? Now, that's probably adding 2 and 2 and getting 7. But that's the first thing I thought of, because honestly, Myles, if you look at the AFC East and you're Bill Belichick and you're looking at the next 2 years with Josh Allen, Tua Tagovailoa, and a great set of weapons and a very imaginative play caller, I think if you're looking at that, and then you're looking at Aaron Rodgers coming in the division, you know that you're fourth by a lot with Mac Jones. And you might not be fourth, and you might have a real chance with Lamar Jackson. So I'll be very interested to see this and to see if this actually has some legs in the coming days.
You know, Peter, this is another one of those situations that makes me think, why is this coming out? You know, who would want this to be out there that Mac Jones has been being shopped? Because this is the first we've heard of it. And if, you know, he was being shopped to the Raiders, the Commanders, and there were a couple other teams that Florio named, then what does that mean, you know? And why would those teams not necessarily go after him, right? If he were being shopped to the Raiders, presumably that would have happened before they elected to go with Jimmy Garoppolo, who was on the open market. And who knows more about Mac Jones than Josh McDaniels? So there's a lot of stuff that has just kind of been bubbling to the surface throughout really the last 12 months when it comes to the Patriots and Mac Jones. I mean, you had the Frankenstein monster that was the offensive staff last year, which obviously didn't work. And Mac Jones had so much on-field demonstrative frustration with that group that, it makes sense that both parties might be frustrated with one another because some of that stuff was just inherently not kept in-house. So given all of that, I don't know where this is going to go, but I mean, when you have reporting that Mac Jones is being shopped already, what does that mean for draft night? I mean, that's something that we've got to pay attention to, because Mac Jones may not be the Patriots quarterback after the first round of the draft. And if that happens, then you could see the Patriots going after Lamar Jackson after the draft, because they wouldn't be giving up this year's first round pick. It would be next year in terms of 2024 and 2025 as a starting point, you know, given to sign Lamar Jackson to an offer sheet. So this is all very fascinating to me.
I want to make one clarification about the Ravens right now. And that is, I don't think the Ravens have to have 2-1s for Lamar Jackson. I think, for instance, if the Indianapolis Colts were to sign Lamar Jackson, which I don't see them doing, then I think that Baltimore would take the 4th pick in the draft, and that's it. So even though the rule says they are allowed to take this, the two sides can negotiate exactly what the deal is.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, I don't think it has to be 2-1s. Now, where the Patriots are going to pick, it might be 2-1s, but there are some picks, and top 10 picks, that I think Baltimore might just take one and move on. But anyway, let's get to our second topic, Jim Trotter. For those who don't know Jim Trotter, he worked for Sports Illustrated for a long time. Then he worked for ESPN. And lately, for the last 5 years, he's worked for the NFL Media Group, doing some TV work, but mostly writing for NFL.com. As he told me over the weekend, he was told last fall that his contract there was no reason to think that his contract wouldn't be renewed. He had his little set to for the second straight year with Roger Goodell. at the commissioner's press conference this year and made a quote that I think probably changed everything for Jim Trotter because he said to Roger Goodell, James Baldwin once said, "I can't believe what you say because I see what you do." And that basically was saying that the NFL has done nothing to promote and retain top minority Black talent inside the NFL media group. So there's that. And obviously he was told that he wouldn't be brought back last week. And I interviewed him on Saturday, and he basically said that he was asked to sign an NDA in exchange for 3 months severance, and he said no. So you can expect a lot more to come out with Trotter. Mike Florio has suggested that he might sue the NFL to get his job back, plus damages. We'll see what happens. I told Jim that we would stay in touch. I'm friends with him. So obviously that clouds some of my thinking. I think my overall thought, Myles, is that because there are so few people, so few journalists at NFL.com and in the NFL media group in general, because there are so few Black journalists, that it's a good idea to not only retain them, but to listen to them. And I think this is one time where the NFL will wish it had really listened to Jim Trotter. The thing that bothered me the most in all the things that he said to me is that in the 1 year after he questioned the NFL at last year's Super Bowl press conference, 14 months ago, no one from the league ever contacted him to talk about it. I mean, clearly it's an issue. One of your biggest employees raised it as an issue publicly, and then you never once talked to him about it. To me, I think the NFL is really going to regret this.
Yeah, it's certainly a clear misstep from the NFL when it comes to not just dismissing Trotter, but dismissing what Trotter was saying in those press conferences and the issues that he raised. And I think the issues that he raised were very valid. To not have anyone Black on the news desk, to not have anyone Black in the executives of the NFL media group. These things make sense to raise as issues when you're talking about a league that looks the way it does when it comes to players. So I applaud Jim Trotter for everything that he has said publicly so far. And you know what? This is going to be something that is obviously going to be worth following. I applaud you, Peter, for reaching out and interviewing him. Because I think that those quotes that he said to you were very, very much needed in the public discourse on this particular situation. And I don't know Jim Trotter personally, but I've admired him for a long time, and that admiration has only grown in the last week or so.
We'll see where this goes from here, but I believe that Trotter is going to have some very interesting stories to tell. And look, it's long been an open secret among people who work for NFL.com that you can go to the edge of the cliff, but you can't go over the cliff. And Jim Trotter went a step too far. But in not taking the severance with the NDA, it's clear that he's got some stories to tell, and I look forward to hearing them. Myles, the meaning of the Thursday night flex debate to me is very interesting, and I'll explain why this is. We talked a little bit about it on the pod last week, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but in the intervening time, I've talked to a couple of owners about this, and the prevailing thought among these two owners was basically that, listen, you need to understand this. The NFL very rarely will bring something up for a vote and advance it to the floor and try to get it passed if they don't think that they have the votes. So for the NFL to only have 22 solid yeses to give Thursday night football flex power In other words, in 4 weeks late in the season, their last 4 weeks, weeks 14 through 17, to be able to say that in those 4 weeks they could flex a bad Thursday night matchup back to Sunday and then to pull a Sunday game and put it on Thursday. There are a lot of owners in the NFL, even some of the ones who voted yes, who were not really bothered by it. And I know 2 of the teams that voted for it are lesser franchises who don't think their ox is going to get gored. They don't think their team would be flexed to a Thursday night game late in the season. So they didn't want to brawl with the league over it. But the teams that I reported who basically voted to say we right now are going against it, obviously led by John Mara of the New York Giants. He's been well publicized as a guy who clearly hates this. He hates flexes in general because he thinks that if the league has signed a deal with a network, with a TV entity, with a streaming group, then the league and that entity ought to live with it. That's the way it goes. But anyway, he was joined in his no vote, all right, by the Pittsburgh Steelers, the New York Jets, Chicago, Green Bay, and New Orleans. And there's 2 more who I couldn't find out, but those were 6 of them. And then also the Carolina and Denver abstaining leads now to the NFL needing to convince 2 of those 10 teams to come over to their side. And conversely, it could be that 1 or 2 of the teams that voted for the measure might have some second thoughts. If John Mara can push something through, maybe John Mara and others, Mark Murphy and Gail Benson, the McCaskey family, Woody Johnson, might be able to change some minds, but we'll see. My gut feeling is the NFL will get its way at the May meetings and it'll pass. But this opened up to me a little schism among owners and the league office that think, in essence, hey, you never gave ESPN, for whatever it's been, 15 years, however long they had Monday Night Football, before this year was the first year they ever gave them the opportunity to flex games. Now in year 2, you give it to Jeff Bezos and Amazon? Come on. And so I think there's some bruised feelings here, Myles, that aren't just going to go away.
I think that makes sense. And I think that anytime you call a behavior abusive, as Mara did last week, when it comes to potentially flexing Thursday night games, I think that, and I don't know how billionaires think because I'm not one, but if I were one of these billionaires that owns one of these teams, right, and I hear that and I voted yes, that would make me have second thoughts. That is one of those owners that you listen to and you think, well, he might really have a point there. And we brought this up last week. Even though Roger Goodell said, yes, there are fans that are affected that would go to the games, but there are millions of fans affected around the nation, around the world that tune into these games. I think you need to pay attention to your paying customer, and people who do make a lot of plans that revolve around the timing and the day of what this game is. So I think that maybe there needs to be more compromise in terms of what the NFL could or could not flex into a Thursday night game and when that game would have to be flexed, right? I mean, because right now they can flex things from, 1:00 on Sunday to the NBC Sunday night game. And I guess they can do this with Monday night games now starting in 2023. I mean, that happens basically 2 weeks before the game. Maybe it's a month, 6 weeks before the last, couple of games that would be eligible to be flexed in the Thursday night window, that you would have to do that, so that at least that gives people more time to do the whole logistics juggling that they would have to do in order to move a game from Thursday to Sunday and from Sunday to a Thursday. There's just a lot that goes into that.
Myles, let's finish with 5 sentences on Lamar Jackson, because I don't want to dwell on this story every single podcast. But the one thing that occurs to me that now we're in April is very simply that Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens are under no pressure until draft weekend to get anything done whatsoever. And so I think that you're not going to see anything this month until at least the draft, and most likely afterwards. Because even if, say, the Patriots were to trade Mac Jones somewhere and then were to go after Lamar Jackson, I just don't see this happening until the precipice, the eve of the draft. And look, it's a long shot anyway for anybody to do this because of all the guaranteed money involved. But I think we're entering a little bit of the long haul phase in the Lamar Jackson story.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see what quarterbacks, if any, that Baltimore targets. And I know we talked about whether it's Carson Wentz or Matt Ryan last week, but Joe Flacco was also on the market. So maybe, I mean, frankly, if I'm Baltimore, I would maybe rather have Joe Flacco and reunite with him than I would with one of those other two guys. So I don't necessarily know what they're going to do. I mean, it's not like they're going to be on the field and really practicing until phase 2 starts in the offseason program anyway. And that's not until the end of the month and then into May when you have OTAs, which obviously you would want your quarterback there for that too. So there are things that Baltimore is going to have to take care of. There are some things that Lamar Jackson is going to have to take care of, but I don't know that there's going to be any big development until probably draft night, Peter, as you were saying, or draft weekend. And so we'll see what happens once we get there. But right now it just seems like there's just kind of this pause, right? I don't necessarily see anybody before the draft giving Lamar Jackson a multi-year offer sheet that would satisfy him, in terms of guaranteed money or anything like that. I don't really see that happening because I feel like that would have happened before if it were going to happen. So we'll see what the next iteration of this story becomes. But again, we're dealing with an unpredictable actor in Lamar Jackson, right? And we don't know what is going to come next with him. So that means we don't know when it's going to come next with him. That's kind of what makes the story fascinating and worth monitoring. But to me, it seems like that next checkpoint should be draft weekend.
You know what I find interesting? I find interesting that Carson Wentz was at the NFL scouting combine trying to meet with teams, trying to get a job. And I find it very interesting that we have not heard word one from Matt Ryan. I don't think he wants to retire. And I just keep it in the back of my head, Myles. I'm just keeping in mind Matt Ryan and some team, maybe Baltimore, that if you wait, and you wait until the dawn of training camp or a week before training camp, I wonder if there will be. Everybody thinks, oh, Matt Ryan's done, he's finished. He might be. But I keep waiting to see what will Matt Ryan do. And I know that's not the most pressing question. However, I'm just totally fascinated that we've heard zero from Matt Ryan. Anyway, we're going to leave it there. Next week, we'll get more into the draft. We'll talk a little bit more about more information we're certainly going to hear. We'll be 2 weeks out from the draft next week. We are going to have on a draft poobah next week on the podcast. So we'll see. I'm not negotiating, but I've asked a couple of draft poobahs to come on next week, and we'll have one of them to talk heavy draft next week. So we'll be back next week with another episode of the Peter King Podcast. Aloha, everyone. Thanks for dealing with us this week as we are in a different locale. And for those who watched this podcast, I'm sorry you didn't hear from Brian Dable, but please go to the audio podcast and listen to an interesting conversation with Dable, I thought, about his history and his life in the NFL, which has had an awful lot of interesting twists and turns. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode, and we'll see you next week for another episode of the Peter King Podcast.